Hi, this is Priyanka, and we are reporting live from JLF 2022, and we are with Mr. William Dalrymple. Hi, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Branka. How are you?
I'm good too. So, tell us about your recent works.
So I've just produced a box set of my four company books, which have taken the last 20 years to write. I began with White Mughals in 1999. Then came The Last Mughal, then Return of a King, and finally The Anarchy. And now they've all been put into proper chronological order, with The Anarchy at the beginning and The Last Mughal at the end. And out in bookshops near you with Bloomsbury.
Okay, sir. So, how did you get to become a literary historian?
Well, I wouldn't describe myself as a literary historian in the sense that literary historians normally refer to people that write the history of literature and study the biographies of writers and poets, which is not what I do. I would describe myself as a historian. And I became a historian by studying history and writing history books.
I mentioned to somebody as a historian, and that person got offended and they said, "No, I'm not a historian. Please mention to me as literary historian."
Well, maybe they were a literary historian, but I'm not.
Okay, sir. So, how did you get into this field?
Well, I studied history at Cambridge, and it's always been my great love. What has slightly changed is I used to be interested in very early archaeology and early then medieval history, and I've ended up spending 20 years on the 18th century, which I wouldn't have guessed I would be doing as a teenager or when I was at college. But that's now done, and I'm going back to my first love. The book I'm currently writing is called The Golden Road, which will be out with Bloomsbury next year. And it's about the diffusion of Indian and Indic culture, Buddhism going north through Afghanistan to China, Hinduism and Buddhism going southeast to Southeast Asia, and then Indian numbers and science going westwards to the Arab world and hence to Europe. Thank you.
Where do you get the inspiration for your book?
Well, with history books, it's not so much inspiration, which is more what happens in fiction, where you have a sudden light bulb moment and then you create a fictional world. But with history, you obviously work and labor hard in primary and secondary sources until you think you've understood your subject. There's still a measure of inspiration in the sense of how do you shape this material, and how do you write it, and how do you form it into a narrative. And my books always have a very strong narrative element. I mean, quite a lot of the history books written in India are analytical and often deal with social and economic forces. The influence of years of dominance of Marxist history here in India. But I always believe that human beings shape events, and so my work is much more biographical and much more narrative based.
So, sir, as you started out as a history student, what advice would you give to current history students who intend to become writers?
Well, there are many different things you can do with history, and many historians go on to become academic historians in colleges, but increasing numbers of historians work outside the academic establishment. It means you don't have to teach students and spend your lives doing academic administration, and can spend more time in the archives researching. One often finds that historians in academia almost sort of end their research when they finish their PhD and end up getting lost in great loops of exams and entrance and finals and rounds of seminars. While if you're working outside the establishment as a writer, you have the ability to spend the rest of your lives in archives and reading, and that's the path I've chosen. Others like Ram Guha the same. But it's a choice. Some people love teaching, and it's a very important profession. I love writing, and that's the profession I've chosen.
So, the current government is changing the course of Indian history. Would you like to comment on that?
Say what is changing the
Course of history by demolishing monuments and things like that.
Well, there has always been elements of history being destroyed. The world is a dynamic place, and for everything that's built, there are other things which are destroyed. Wars happen, and so on. But certainly, you're right that there are many parts of the world where history is embattled by present politics. And another example would be Israel-Palestine, where, for example, the Israeli state highlights the Jewish remains and often demolishes Byzantine or Arab settlements, or doesn't highlight them in the presentation of ruins, or will dig through other layers to get to the Jewish remains. Likewise here, obviously, we're in the middle of a saffron resurgence. People are much more interested now in the Hindu history. And there are good and bad things in that. I mean, on one hand, one sees the Mughals denigrated, which I think is a bad thing because they were fascinating and great empire. On the other hand, though, it's great if people learn more about Vijayanagara, the Cholas, the Pallavas, Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, and all the rest of them. And a book I'd recommend is Anirudh Kanisetti's new book, Lords of the Deccan, which seems to me to wonderfully bring alive the medieval Hindu kingdoms of the south, which is a positive thing.
So why do you focus on Mughal in your books?
Well, I haven't focused on the Mughals. I've focused on the company. I've done 4 books on the period between the end of the Mughals and the beginning of the company Raj, which is slightly different. I mean, I've never really written about the great Mughals like Jahangir and Shah Jahan. That's before my period. My period really begins with the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, and I deal with the period when both the French East India Company and the British East India Company are asserting themselves. And that's what the 4 company quartet books are all about.
So, would you like to comment on the depiction of history in school textbooks in India?
Well, I'm out of date. I haven't written about the textbooks in India for 20 years, but I think it's a very problematic thing what to teach your children when history itself is embattled and historians disagree on the past. The old history books written in the post-independence generation, generally written by Marxists, they stress the unity of Hindus and Muslims in the aftermath of bloodshed and partition, and they dwell mainly on social and economic forces. There is, I think, a very widespread feeling that parts of Indian history are ignored, that the Pallavas and Cholas and so on, the southern kingdoms, are ignored. But more importantly, I think many people feel that these textbooks are just very boring and very dry. And almost every fan letter I've ever got from an Indian reader always begins, "I hated history at school, but..." And so, in a sense, I think the biggest problem is not political, but the fact that these books are so deathly dry. And the Indian exam system seems to favor parrot learning of text and remembering of dates, which is not what history should be about. It should be about understanding the forces that shape human history.
So, Indian history writing has recently gained prominence in the literary scene. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's been odd that there has been so little good history available. When I first came 20 years ago, India was dominating the world with its wonderful fiction writers. Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai, Vikram Seth, Amitav Ghosh, and so on were winning all the prizes. But none of the non-fiction prizes were being won by Indians. And to this day, the non-fiction equivalent of the Booker, which is called the Bailey Gifford Prize, I think only 2 Indians have ever been shortlisted, which is Ram Guha and Sawant Subramaniam. And so it's very odd. You have now in this country a very strong tradition of fiction and a much less strong tradition of non-fictional writing, which includes the writing of history. And Indian academic historians, I think, have been guilty of only writing for each other and engaging in their own debates within the ivory towers of conferences and so on, and not reaching out in the manner that, say, British and American historians do. There's no equivalent to Stephen Greenblatt, the professor of Shakespeare at Harvard, whose book The Swerve sold 1 million copies, was number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and won a Pulitzer. You couldn't point to a single Indian historian that has successfully won all the literary prizes and become a bestseller. And it's odd. But anyway, that's changing now. As I say, Anirudh Kanisetti, who I mentioned, wonderful historian, Manu Pillai, Ira Mukoti, lots of new historians, lots of Anshul Malhotra's fantastic writer. And this is about time this happened. I think it's a very good thing.
How did your COVID-19 pandemic affect the Indian publishing industry?
Well, I can't speak about the publishing industry, but as far as writing is concerned and writers, it made very little difference to us. I think, fun enough, I mean, other than we were probably the community least affected because we do anyway sit at home and stare at our screens. And if you're writing a book, you are effectively in lockdown anyway. I'm going to start my next book, the actual writing bit of it, next week, and it'll be just like lockdown. I won't go out. I'll have a boring time at home. It'll be like another lockdown all over again. So I think what many people have reported, in fact, this year's festival reflects that, is that writers became even more prolific than before because they had nothing else to do, nowhere else to go, no festivals to go to, no lectures to give, and so on. And many of the books which are being given platforms at this festival are books which were written in lockdown in those circumstances, that we're now beginning to see a rush of pandemic written books appearing, and many of them are very good.
So, if somebody wants to submit their draft to a publisher, what advice would you give them?
Well, I'm not a publisher, I'm a writer, but my advice is very simple, is that you have to make your proposal, which should be probably not much longer than 10 or 12 pages, instantly attractive and as brilliantly crafted as you can. You don't dash off a quick idea on the back of an envelope. This is like writing a check to yourself. And if you write a brilliant proposal, you can get a large sum of money and support yourself during the difficult process of writing your first book. But if you produce an inadequate proposal, you'll probably end up with no advance or a very small one. So the proposal is the most important thing of all. Take more trouble with it even than the finished book, is my advice.
So, this is the first edition of JLF after the 2 pandemic-ridden years. So, what challenges did you face in organizing it?
Well, there's still many countries where don't have flights to or visas available, and so we've always had a mix of 1/3 Farangi authors coming in to 2/3 authors from around the South Asian subcontinent. And so this year, very few Pakistanis, very few Bangladeshis, and almost no foreigners outside England and America. We've had none of our usual Caribbean poets, none of our usual Latin American novelists, none of our usual American politicians or anything. Well, we had 1 or 2 Americans, in fact, but and 1 or 2 Brits. But it's been and that has been mainly in Zoom. So we've had a very internationally flavored Zoom hybrid beginning to the festival, followed by a very more heavily Indian and local on the ground festival. But that has had its positive elements. I mean, there's been 6 or 7 spectacular Indian art history sessions, an awful lot of fascinating political discussions, and so it swings and roundabouts. What you lose in cosmopolitanism and internationalism, you gain in in-depth study of Indian art, culture, religion, and politics.
Definitely. So, you announced the JLF Soneva Fushi yesterday. So, tell us about that.
This is one of the great resorts of the world, and it's going to be a lovely treat for us all to go there. We're all exhausted after this, and I think we're all secretly thinking this is going to be part holiday and as well as a literary festival. I can't wait for it. We have an amazing A-team of no one ever will refuse an invitation to the best resort in the Maldives. And so we've been able to get, Chimamanda, extraordinary lineup, Stephen Fry, Peter Frankopan. We've never had Andre Asserman. We've never had such an amazing lineup of writers. Everyone said yes. But the main work of the festival, I don't wish in any way to diminish our Maldives thing, which is going to be a terrific treat for everyone. But it's only 30 writers, and it's our main work is here in Jaipur, where it's 300 writers and an amazing range of sessions available. Normally we are completely free, as you know. This year we had to charge a little bit as our finances have been pretty rocky after the pandemic, and we were trying to avoid firing our staff, to be honest. And we just need the money to keep going. So we charge this year. Hopefully we're going to go back to free entry next year. And hopefully next year we'll back to our normal size. It's a little bit smaller than usual this year, I think, a little bit quieter. But some people have said that's an improvement. So I think some people found it a bit overwhelming in the past, vast crowds which used to turn up.
So, I'm sure it will be an immersive experience for all the attendees.
Thank you so much.